It was said in certain drawing rooms, the kind lit by too many candles and too little mercy, that the Duke of Ashworth had never once been surprised. He had inherited his title at 19, his composure somewhat earlier, and the particular variety of coldness that passed, in aristocratic circles, for dignity. He was 32 years old and had been engaged 3 times. The first lady had died of a fever before the banns were read twice. The second had eloped with a cavalry officer whose charm exceeded his fortune by a margin too wide for arithmetic. The third had simply disappeared from a dinner party and been found the following morning, still in her evening slippers, already aboard a mail coach to Edinburgh. None of this had altered the Duke's expression in any observable way. His household staff, who were loyal in the manner of people who are very well paid and therefore see very much, spoke of him in cautious terms and with the wary admiration one reserves for a cliffside that has not yet fallen. He had therefore requested a 4th arrangement. Not a courtship. The Duke of Ashworth did not court. Courtship implied a degree of personal investment that he had decided, somewhere around the age of 26, was an inefficient use of a finite resource. He made inquiries through his solicitor, communicated his requirements to the Earl of Fenwick across a letter of 4 careful paragraphs, and awaited the delivery of an appropriate daughter. The requirements were not complex. He had written, quiet, well-bred, without excessive opinions or visible emotions, suitable for the management of 3 country estates, and the social obligations incumbent upon a Duchess of Ashworth. He had used the word suitable 4 times in 4 paragraphs, which his solicitor had privately considered an omen of the first order, but had recorded faithfully in the duplicate copy and said nothing. What arrived at Ashworth Park on the 3rd of October was not, by any reasonable measure, what had been requested. She came without announcement. The Earl of Fenwick had written to confirm his eldest daughter, Miss Genevieve, would arrive on Thursday with her maid, her trunks, and presumably the appropriate qualities. What arrived instead, 2 days early, in the middle of a grey and entirely uncooperative Tuesday afternoon, was a travelling carriage of questionable upkeep, from which descended a young woman in a plain dark travelling coat who paused on the gravel drive, looked up at the limestone facade of Ashworth Park with the expression of someone taking the measure of an opponent, and stood very still for a moment that was slightly longer than was usual. She was not, by the standard the Duke's mother had spent 30 years codifying, beautiful. She was not small and fair and accommodating of gaze. She had dark eyes that moved across a room the way a solicitor's move across a contract, looking for the clause that would cause difficulty, the subsection that modified the main agreement in ways one had not anticipated. Her face was composed in the manner of someone who had learned, through some specific and not entirely gentle education, that composure was not a grace but a discipline, and she had drilled it into herself until it held under conditions that would have cracked a less methodical character. She was perhaps 25, which was, by the calculations of the marriage market, already a minor failure requiring explanation. She had under her arm a book. He noticed that particularly later, when he was examining the memory with the attention he gave to things that had surprised him. The book under the arm, the unapologetic way she stood in his drive, as though she had arrived somewhere she had not yet decided whether to approve of. The Duke was informed of her arrival while reviewing correspondence in his study. He did not hurry. He appeared in the entrance hall 4 minutes later, with the measured tread of a man who had never in his life been required to hurry for anyone, and found the young woman standing before his butler with her travelling coat still on, and the volume tucked under her left arm. Montaigne's essays, he noted in the French. The edition from Lyon, if he was not mistaken, which he generally was not. "You are not Miss Genevieve Fenwick." It was not a question. She turned to face him with an expression so precisely calibrated to politeness that it communicated, beneath that polished surface, a complete and very decided opinion of the remark. "No, Your Grace. I am Miss Claudia Fenwick, Genevieve's sister, the younger sister, the second sister. Yes." There was a distinction there. He heard it immediately. The careful correction that was not quite a correction, the specificity that refused to accept his framing of the relationship. He was not, whatever else he was, inattentive. "Where is Miss Genevieve?" "Married, Your Grace, as of the 14th of September. She and Mr. Hartley are presently in the north of Italy, in the vicinity of Lake Como, I believe. And your father sent you in her place." "My father sent a letter explaining the situation in full." "I gather it did not arrive before I did." "It did not. A pause fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, not dramatic, merely consequential, spreading in concentric circles that touched everything in the room. From the first landing, the Duke's mother, who had positioned herself there with the strategic instincts of a woman who had survived 2 monarchs and 4 London seasons without losing a single social battle, watched her son's face with the attention of a general reading a map. What she observed was this. He looked at Miss Claudia Fenwick for precisely 7 seconds. Not the look of appreciation, not the look of social assessment, but the look of a man who has been handed something different from what he ordered and is deciding, with genuine curiosity, rather than simple displeasure, what it actually is. Then he said, quietly, and without particular inflection, in the tone of a man completing an inventory of a room he had expected to contain other things, "You are not what I ordered." Miss Fenwick received this. She did not colour. She did not flinch or look away, or rearrange her expression into any of the shapes that women in difficult drawing rooms had been rearranging their expressions into since the beginning of time. She looked at the Duke of Ashworth with those dark, thorough eyes, and she said in a voice of such serene and utter composure that his mother, on the landing, very nearly smiled, "No, Your Grace, I rarely am." She was given a room in the East Wing. It was a good room, a room of green silk walls and windows that looked out over the formal gardens to the south, with a fire already lit and a writing desk of polished walnut positioned to catch the afternoon light. She understood from its quality that the Duke had not intended to insult her by the arrangement. The room was simply good, because good rooms were what Ashworth contained. In the same way the gravel was raked and the silver was polished and the fires were always already lit when one entered. Because excellence here was not aspiration, but administration. Her maid, a small Welsh woman named Bronwyn, who had been with her for 6 years, and who feared nothing but loud dogs, and the sort of man who smiled before he spoke, unpacked her trunks with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to read the quality of a situation from the quality of a linen press. She said nothing. Bronwyn was, among her many excellent qualities, a woman who understood when silence was the most useful thing she possessed. Claudia sat at the window with Montaigne open on her lap and looked out at the gardens, their rigid symmetry, their clipped and unwavering certainty, their commitment to being exactly and only what they had been designed to be, and thought about her father and the letter that had apparently not arrived, and about her sister, Genevieve, who had had the extraordinary good fortune to fall in love with someone else before the Duke of Ashworth could present her with an emerald and an expectation. She had not been consulted, she rarely was. She was 24 years old, the second of 5 Fenwick daughters, possessed of a modest portion, a sharp mind that her father had called inconvenient since approximately her 12th year, and no particular beauty of the type that drew immediate attention in a ballroom. She had been brought here to be inspected, and, very probably, declined, after which her father would negotiate with some other family for some other arrangement, and Claudia would return to Fenwick Hall, and her mother's anxious silences, and her younger sister's bright, uncomplicated futures, and the shelf upon which second daughters of modest fortune and inconvenient minds were placed with perfect gentleness and left. She had known, before the carriage had even left her father's drive, how this would most likely end. What she had not anticipated was the Duke's face in the moment he had said it. "You are not what I ordered," because it had not been cruel. Cruelty would have been easier. It had been something more complex and therefore more difficult to know what to do with. It had been simply, unflinchingly, almost academically true, delivered in the way of a man who has received unexpected weather and is recording the fact for the purposes of accuracy, without any particular feeling about it and without any expectation that the weather would take offense. She turned a page of Montaigne. The October light was failing early over the Ashworth gardens, turning the hedgerows grey and the fountain silver and the whole formal landscape, the colour of something that has decided to let winter come. She was not, she told herself with precision, offended. She was, however, paying attention. She had found, over 24 years, that paying attention was the most reliable thing she had to offer any situation. The letter from the Earl of Fenwick arrived the following morning, confirming what Miss Claudia Fenwick had already confirmed in person, and adding very little of practical use except the information that the Earl considered this arrangement most satisfactory and hoped the Duke would find Claudia an agreeable substitute for her sister. The word substitute had not been chosen with any awareness of its implications. The Earl of Fenwick was not a man given to awareness of implications. It was, Claudia had long concluded, the quality that had most decisively shaped the texture of her childhood, and the reason she had spent so many years becoming very good at the implications that others declined to notice. The Duke read the letter at breakfast. He did not share its contents. He folded it with great precision along its original creases and placed it beside his coffee cup and continued eating with the methodical composure he applied to all activities, as though every action, correspondence, eggs, the management of an unexpected guest, required the same steady and unhurried degree of attention. Claudia, seated at the far end of the long breakfast table, with the Dowager Duchess positioned between them like a chaperone, who was also, she suspected, conducting her own quiet inquiry, ate her breakfast and looked at the light on the garden and did not ask what the letter contained. She had decided, somewhere between her first cup of tea and the arrival of the toast rack, that she would not need to ask. She was good at reading rooms, at reading the small, controlled choreography of other people's composures, and the Duke's composure that morning communicated everything the letter had said without requiring her to hear a word of it. He was considering proceeding with the arrangement. This surprised her rather more than she had expected to be surprised. The Dowager Duchess, a woman of 70, with excellent posture, excellent memory, and opinions she had spent decades compressing into remarks of 2 or 3 words that hit with the force of cannon fire, said over her marmalade and with an air of perfect innocence, "I understand you read French, Miss Fenwick." Etienne noticed the Montaigne. Claudia looked briefly at the Duke. His name, apparently, was Etienne. No one had mentioned this. His letters had been signed only with his title. She filed the name away. "Yes, Your Grace, I find him useful for long carriage journeys." Useful. An interesting word for a philosopher. He is most useful, I think, when he is describing the ways in which people deceive themselves. It becomes surprisingly practical in daily life to have such precise examples to hand. One recognizes situations more quickly when one has good models for them. A brief silence. The Dowager looked at her son. Her son had set down his coffee cup and was looking at Miss Fenwick with an expression that was not quite the expression he employed for weather reports. "And do you encounter many such situations?" the Dowager asked pleasantly. "I live in my father's house, Your Grace. With 4 sisters and a very active social calendar, I have encountered nearly all of them." The Dowager Duchess laughed, a short, genuine sound quickly contained. Across the table the Duke said nothing, but he did not return to his correspondence. He proposed on a Thursday, 3 days later, which she thought was fast and said so. And the saying so was, she realized as she said it, itself a measure of how quickly she had decided that honesty with this particular man was not a liability. They were walking the South Garden, an invitation extended the previous evening with the neutral courtesy of a man who includes another person in a daily practice without revising the practice itself. She had accepted with the equally neutral courtesy of a woman who has decided to observe a thing before deciding what to think of it. They walked in a silence that was, she had begun to notice, not uncomfortable. He walked alongside her without the restless social energy of men who experience silence as a problem requiring solution. He simply walked, and the silence held between them like a third companion, quiet and apparently welcome. He stopped beside the stone bench beneath the lime tree at the south end of the garden. The lime tree was bare, all its leaves gone to the October ground, and its branches made their complicated angular arguments against a white and uncommitted sky. He stopped and turned to face her and produced a ring. It was a remarkable ring. A square-cut emerald, very old and very green, set in heavy gold with small diamonds pressed at each corner, and it had the particular look of something that had been significant for a very long time and knew it. "I think there is no practical benefit to delay," he said. "You are aware of the arrangement your father proposed. I am prepared to proceed with it." She looked at the ring in his extended hand. She looked at his face. He was watching her with those careful, well-managed eyes, the eyes of a man who notices things and keeps the noticing private. And she thought, he is not nervous. This is not the stillness of a man suppressing nerves. This is simply a man who does not experience proposing marriage as a vulnerability, any more than he experiences reviewing correspondence as one. And that told her a great deal. "You said I was not what you ordered," she said. "I said that, yes, and yet here is the ring, and yet here is the ring." She did not take it immediately. He held it with the patient steadiness of a man accustomed to not being kept waiting, and therefore wholly unprepared for it. "What did you order, precisely, if I may ask?" A very slight pause, the pause of a man not accustomed to being asked to articulate his own requirements in this particular tense. "Compliance, principally. Discretion. The management of social obligations without requiring my constant personal attention to their execution. An understanding of what a duchy requires, and a willingness to provide it without friction. And I do not appear to promise those things. You appear, Miss Fenwick, to promise a great many things that were not on the original list." It was not a complaint. She heard that clearly. It was, and this was the thing she turned over afterward in the lamplight of the east wing, examining it carefully from every angle. It was something closer to observation, to the specific admission of a man who has received something unexpected and found that the unexpected thing is not unwelcome. She looked at the ring for a long moment. The garden was very still. The bare lime tree made its arguments. Somewhere behind the stable block, a door banged in the wind. The gardener had stopped raking. "I should like to be very clear," she said, "before we proceed any further in any direction. I would expect nothing less. I will not be managed. I will not be ornamental. I will not pretend, for the comfort of your guests, or the convenience of your household, or the satisfaction of my father, to be a woman of fewer opinions than I actually hold. I will fulfill every obligation that falls within the role I would occupy. I will do so competently and without complaint. But I will not pretend to be a different person, because a different person would be more comfortable for the people around me to accommodate." She met his eyes. "If these conditions are acceptable, then so is the ring." The Duke of Ashworth looked at Miss Claudia Fenwick, at the ring held, still unplaced, in her ungloved hand, and said nothing for 4 full seconds. She counted them. He was, she understood, not at a loss. He was simply processing a document more complex than the one he had anticipated. Then he said, in the voice of a man who has reached the end of a very careful calculation, "Put it on, Miss Fenwick." It was not a concession. It was not, precisely, an agreement to her terms. It was the voice of a man who has arrived at a decision by a route he had not originally planned to travel, and who has decided, having arrived, that he is not displeased with the destination. She put it on. The emerald sat on her finger with the authority of something that has waited a long time for the right occasion. They walked back to the house in silence. Not the neutral silence of people who have nothing to say, but the particular silence of 2 people who have just said something significant and are, for the moment, content to let it stand. London in November had the grey and punishing quality of something committed to being uncomfortable, as though the city had decided that warmth was an indulgence unsuited to serious business. The Ashworth townhouse on Grosvenor Square was larger than Claudia's entire childhood home and maintained with the kind of invisible efficiency that only very old money can produce. Fires already lit when one entered a room, flowers arranged by 8 in the morning by hands one never saw, meals planned by someone whose planning one would never observe or be consulted about. She had grown up in a house where one heard the kitchen in the afternoons and felt the cold in the mornings and was aware at all times of the domestic architecture of daily life. Ashworth's house operated like a stage that reset itself between acts, and she found it both impressive and, in some way she was still determining, faintly melancholy, as though comfort provided by invisible labor was a thing one was not supposed to notice. The engagement had been announced in the Gazette on a Monday. The drawing-room had received approximately 40 callers in the following 6 days, each arriving with the particular social hunger of people who have heard something remarkable and wish to observe it at close range before forming and distributing their opinion. They looked at Claudia the way one looks at a painting purchased at auction for more than was expected, with a mixture of sincere appraisal and the private conviction that the buyer has perhaps made an error of enthusiasm that only time will fully expose. She was aware of what they thought. She had always been good at knowing what people thought, while they were saying something entirely different. It was one of the inconvenient qualities her father had identified early and never quite known what to do with. Lady Margrave arrived on the 2nd Tuesday. She was 50, handsome in the way of a woman who has spent decades engineering her own handsomeness and considers the result a personal achievement, and she was the Duke's closest godmother. A distinction she wore with the quiet authority of someone who considers family connections a form of property. She sat in the best chair, as though it were a throne, she had previously vacated and expected to reclaim at will, and looked at Claudia over her tea with the interested, unhurried attention of a magistrate reviewing a petition that has arrived from an unexpected quarter. "You are not at all what I expected," she said. "Not unkindly, exactly, not kindly either," with the precision of a woman for whom those two categories have long since collapsed into the single category of useful. "So I have been told, Lady Margrave," Claudia said pleasantly. Etienne's first fiancée was an absolute beauty, quite extraordinary. The second was charm itself. Every room improved the moment she entered it. The third was accomplished in the way that people are when they have had excellent instructors and sufficient leisure. A pause. Timed, Claudia noticed, with the precision of an instrument. One wonders what category you occupy. The room held its breath. 6 other callers had arranged themselves in postures of apparent fascination with the fireplace, the window, the pattern of the carpet, anything but the direct theatre of what was occurring between the two women at the tea table. Claudia set down her cup with the deliberate calm of a person who has identified a weapon and decided to use it only once, and only well. "The category of women who intend to remain, Lady Margrave," she said. "I find it the most practically useful one." A silence of a different quality fell over the room. Lady Margrave looked at her. Something shifted in the older woman's expression. Not displeasure, she was far too sophisticated for simple displeasure, but a recalibration. The magistrate, having heard the petition stated rather more crisply than anticipated, finding it somewhat more substantive than the paper it had arrived on had suggested. She said nothing more on the subject. She stayed for another 40 minutes and spoke about the Kemble Theatre production with every appearance of genuine interest. When she left, she shook Claudia's hand, instead of inclining her head, which the Dowager Duchess, observing from the settee, noted with the private satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting for her son to make an interesting choice for a considerable number of years. The Duke had been at the window throughout. He had been standing with his coffee, apparently attending to the view of Grosvenor Square in the way he often attended to other things, while attending to everything in the room. Claudia had spent 3 weeks learning that his apparent inattentiveness was in fact the sharpest and most comprehensive attention he possessed. He simply declined to arrange his face around it in the way that other people did. When the callers had gone and the room had emptied back to its costly, beautiful, carefully maintained silence, he turned from the window and looked at her. "The category of women who intend to remain," he said. "I thought it accurate. It was more than accurate. It was a threat and a declaration of intent delivered simultaneously, clothed in perfect social courtesy." He paused. "Lady Margrave has not been outmaneuvered in a drawing-room in approximately 20 years. I would know. I have watched people attempt it. I was not attempting to outmaneuver her. I know. That is precisely what made it effective." She looked at him. The November afternoon had turned the room the color of amber, and his face in that particular light was a thing she had not yet entirely decoded. Always composed, always restrained, but with the composure of someone who has built it carefully over something that required building over. She had met men of genuine coldness, men for whom the social surface and the interior were one continuous material. He was not that. He was something more complex. A man of genuine depth, who had decided at some specific and perhaps formative point that depth was an administrative problem best managed through containment. She was unkind, Claudia said. I simply declined to be diminished by it. Most women in your position would have colored and moved the conversation elsewhere. Most women in my position have learned that coloring and moving the conversation is interpreted as confirmation that the unkindness was deserved. It is a very efficient system when you examine it. The cruelty justifies itself through the response it produces. He was quiet for a moment. Outside on the square, a carriage passed with the particular loud authority of a vehicle that expects to be noticed. "How long have you been in your position?" he asked. She understood the question. It was not a question about her age or her unmarried state, not precisely. It was a question about the specific curriculum she had received. The education of a woman who had learned to hold her ground, not because anyone had taught her to, but because no one had protected her from needing to. It was in its way the most personal question he had asked her. "Long enough, Your Grace," she said, and left it there. He nodded, slowly, with the air of a man receiving information he had suspected and wished confirmed. He set down his coffee cup and said, "And this?" She thought afterward was the first moment she had looked at him. and seen something that was not architecture, not management, not the careful administration of a complex social existence, but something that was simply, quietly human. Lady Margrave will not be unkind to you again. I will see to it. Not warmth, exactly. Warmth was too loose a word, too soft at the edges. Something older and more reliable than warmth. The particular gravity of a man who, having noticed an injustice, has decided quietly and without theatre that it will not continue. She had not asked for protection. She had never asked for it, and had long since stopped expecting it. But she found, to her own private and considerable surprise, that this specific form of it, quiet, certain, requiring absolutely nothing from her in acknowledgement or exchange, was not entirely unwelcome. It was, in fact, rather profoundly not unwelcome. She looked at the emerald on her hand and said simply, "Thank you." It was the most unguarded thing she had said to him in 3 weeks. She was fairly certain he knew it. She was fairly certain he filed it away. The Pemberton ball fell on a Friday in December, 3 weeks before the wedding that had been, with the Duke's characteristic administrative efficiency, scheduled for the 6th of January. Claudia had not been consulted on the date. She had noticed this. She noticed most things, and had filed it away alongside a growing collection of similar observations about the man she was going to marry. His habit of deciding arrangements and announcing them rather than proposing and waiting for agreement. His assumption that decisions made correctly were the same as decisions made jointly. His apparent blindness to the difference between the management of property and the management of people he actually cared about, if indeed he cared about people, which she had not yet fully determined, though she had begun to have her suspicions. She wore green silk to the Pemberton ball. It matched the emerald more closely than she had intended when she had chosen the gown, and she had looked at the coincidence in the mirror before descending and thought, well, there are worse things to be than obvious, so long as what you are being obvious about is true. The Duke arrived separately, as was customary. He found her within 4 minutes of his arrival, which was, she had begun to understand, also customary. He had a way of locating her in a crowded room with the purposeful efficiency of someone who has, without announcing it, decided that the room is worth entering only insofar as it contains her. She had not yet decided what to do with this information. They danced once in the first set. He danced with the contained precision he brought to everything, well and correctly, and with no unnecessary ornamentation, and he held her at the precisely appropriate distance and said nothing in particular, and she had the novel experience of dancing with a man whose silence was not absence but presence. The specific, concentrated presence of someone attending, very carefully, to everything she was not saying. "Lord Castle has been watching you since you arrived," he said, as they turned at the corner of the set. "I had noticed. He is a man of significant charm and negligible character. He pursues women of property. He is not interested in the woman herself, unless the woman happens also to be the property." "I know. You knew." Within approximately 3 minutes of our introduction at Lady Harrington's last Tuesday, the charm was genuine. He is actually charming, which is the more dangerous version, but the interest was in the settlement. A pause as they moved through the figure, and yet you remained civil to him for the better part of an hour. Civility toward people one has accurately assessed costs nothing and reveals nothing. Incivility, on the other hand, immediately communicates the nature of one's assessment and allows the subject to revise their behavior accordingly. It seemed more useful to maintain the appearance of ordinary social warmth. He looked at her with an expression she had learned to read as something between admiration and the particular unease of a man who finds he has been holding an incomplete picture of a person and is now being required to revise it. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "I had a very instructive girlhood. In your father's house. In my father's house." They finished the dance in a silence that held more information than most conversations. It happened an hour later. She would replay it afterward in the manner she applied to events that had mattered, with thorough and dispassionate attention, examining each element separately. Looking for the moment she could have altered the shape of it. She always arrived at the same conclusion. There was no such moment. Humiliations of that particular kind are structured so that the target's choice is narrowed to 2, submit or respond. Either way, the humiliation has succeeded in its central purpose, which is to make itself the most significant event in the room. She had stepped onto the terrace for air, the ballrooms of December always being simultaneously too warm and too cold. the candlelight burning in rooms that the frost tried to enter through every window frame. The terrace was cold and empty, and she had stood for a moment with the December air on her face and the garden below her black and silver in the moonlight, thinking about nothing in particular, which was a rare luxury. She heard them before she saw them. 3 women emerging from the doors 20 feet down the terrace, their voices lowered to the specific pitch that carries in cold air while appearing private. She recognized the voice of Mrs. Cassel Bright, wife of the man who had been watching her earlier, sister-in-law to the Lord Cassel the Duke had identified, before she recognized the words. She could have retreated. She chose not to. One learns over time that retreating from a conversation being had about oneself is indistinguishable, socially, from consent. Mrs. Cassel Bright did not stop speaking when Claudia appeared at the edge of the lamplight. This was unmistakably the point. The second daughter, you understand, which really does tell you everything you need to know about the arrangement. Fenwick simply substituted one girl for the other, as one might return an order to a linen draper and request a different color. And Ashworth accepted, which I think tells those of us paying attention everything about what he was actually seeking. He needed something manageable and inoffensive, and she was, apparently, the nearest available option at short notice. The 2 other women looked at Claudia. Mrs. Cassel Bright looked at Claudia with the specific expression of a person who has just said a thing aloud that she has been composing in private for some time, and finds the saying of it publicly to be its own reward. The terrace was cold. The windows behind them threw yellow lamplight across the stone. The December air smelled of dead leaves and something burning in a grate somewhere below, and the night had the particular quality of a night that is waiting for a decision. Claudia stood in it. She did not colour. She did not alter her expression. She looked at Mrs. Cassel Bright with the quietness that was not submission but precision, the silence of a person who has selected, from a range of possible responses, the one that will be most exactly sufficient, and said, "It is a cold evening for that kind of conversation, Mrs. Cassel Bright. I should have thought you'd be warmer indoors." And then, before Mrs. Cassel Bright could organize a response, before the 2 other women could rearrange their faces into something less transparent, she heard him. His voice arrived before his shadow did, low and unhurried, and with an edge that operated beneath the level of social register, felt more than heard. "Miss Fenwick!" He was at the terrace door. He had heard it. She was certain he had heard enough, if not all of it, and he was looking at Mrs. Cassel Bright with an expression she had not seen from him before and had not known he possessed. Not anger. Something considerably more effective than anger. The specific, narrow, utterly unemotional regard of a man with very large social power who has decided, quietly and without announcement, to apply it to a particular problem. "Mrs. Cassel Bright." His voice was perfectly civil. It was, she thought, the most frightening civil voice she had ever heard. "I had not seen you arrive this evening. I was under the impression you were occupied this month. The Cassel Brights generally winter in the country, I believe." "Your Grace, Yes, we have been. The city has kept us rather longer this year. London is so very demanding in December. I am sure you are finding it quite exhausting." He allowed precisely 1 beat of silence. "I believe Miss Fenwick would benefit from returning inside. The cold is sharp tonight. Will you excuse us?" Not a question. The sentence structure admitted no space for it to be a question, Mrs. Cassel Bright, who understood the mechanism of social consequence better than she understood most things, understood this completely. He offered Claudia his arm. She took it. They walked back through the terrace doors and into the warmth and noise of the ballroom, and when they had moved far enough into the crowd that the terrace was behind them and all of its inhabitants reduced to a distant social problem, she said, "You did not need to do that. I told you she would not be unkind to you again." That was a specific instance rather than a general principle. Yes, it was. She looked up at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the room, at the dancers and the candles, and the 200 people who were entirely unaware that something quiet and consequential had just occurred on a December terrace. But there was something in the line of his jaw, something in the way he held himself as they moved through the crowd, that was not quite composed. It was the held quality of a man who has felt something sharply and has decided that the present moment is not the appropriate context for it, she thought. "He is angry on my behalf," she thought. "I did not ask for this. I have not asked for anything of this nature since I was old enough to understand that asking produced nothing. and I do not know with any certainty what to do with a man who offers it without being asked. And I am. And this was the thought she did not permit herself to finish. Not then. Not in the middle of a ballroom with 200 witnesses. I am more moved by it than I have been by anything in quite some time, she said. I do not actually require champagne. No, but it gave us a direction to move in. She almost smiled. He saw it. She was certain he saw it, and equally certain he would say nothing about it, would simply file it away alongside all the other small things he had observed and kept, the accumulated evidence of a man who had been paying attention from the very first Tuesday in October, when she had stood in his entrance hall in a travelling coat and declined to be weathered. She returned the ring on a Monday, the 21st of December, the morning after a dinner at which the Earl of Fenwick had appeared without prior arrangement, which was, she had learned, her father's preferred mode of operation in all matters he anticipated, might be refused if negotiated in advance, and proceeded, over the course of 3 courses, a remove and the port, to discuss his daughter's settlement terms with the Duke of Ashworth in the manner of a man renegotiating the purchase of livestock. He spoke about Claudia's portion, about the Fenwick Northern property and its likely yield, about certain considerations he felt had not been adequately reflected in the original agreement given the altered circumstances of the match, and he did all of this with Claudia seated at the table, present in body and, to her father's apparent reckoning, entirely absent in every other sense. She had sat through it. She was good at sitting through things. She had had a great deal of practice. She ate her soup and she ate her fish, and she watched the candles, and she watched the Duke's face across the table, and she saw, in the very slight hardening at the outer corners of his eyes, the expression she had come to read as the outermost layer of something much larger operating below, that he was receiving this information in the spirit of a man who had suspected something and now had it confirmed, and who was deciding, with great precision, what to do about the confirmation. Her father left at 11, well pleased, as he generally was after conversations that had proceeded to his own satisfaction, without producing clear evidence of dissatisfaction in others. She had said good night and gone upstairs. She had lain in the east wing room, the room with the green silk walls and the windows over the garden, and looked at the ceiling for 3 hours and thought about what it meant, specifically and in concrete terms, to be discussed in the third person at a table at which you were physically present. She thought about it with the thoroughness she applied to all things that hurt her, which was the thoroughness of dissection. She wanted to understand the shape of the pain before she decided what to do about it. What she arrived at by 3 in the morning was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. It was clarity. The particular, quiet, devastating clarity of a person who has looked at a situation from every possible angle and arrived at the same conclusion from all of them. This cannot be the shape of the life she agrees to. Not even for this, not even for him. She had not entirely understood until that thought reached its end, and she lay in the silence with it, that him had become a category in her thinking that carried real weight. This was its own form of information. In the morning she rose before Bronwyn arrived, dressed in the simplest gown that could be considered appropriate for a Tuesday, and took the ring from its box on the dressing table. She held it for a long moment, the emerald cold in the morning light, the gold substantial, the small diamonds at each corner as steady and unapologetic as they had been on the first day she had looked at them. It had the weight of something important. That was the most painful thing about it. She found the Duke in his study. He was at the desk when she entered, writing, the scratch of the pen audible in the quiet of the winter morning, and he looked up with the sharp, swift attention of a man who has learned to read interruptions quickly. She closed the door behind her. Bronwyn knew she had gone, had said nothing, had looked at her with the particular, steady look of a woman who trusts the judgment of the person she serves, even when she herself would have chosen differently. Claudia crossed the room. She set the ring on the desk between them, on the polished wood, where it sat in the grey morning light, with the authority of something being returned, rather than discarded. There is a difference, and the difference matters. He looked at it. He looked at her. The study was quiet. Rain had begun against the windows, the first real rain of the winter, determined and unhurried, the kind of rain that means to continue. Claudia, the first time, her given name in his voice, arriving with the specific quality of something a careful man has been withholding, and has decided now that withholding costs more than the release. She felt it with the precision of someone who has learned to feel things precisely, having learned long ago that imprecision in feeling leads to imprecision in decision. "Last night," she said, "my father discussed the yield of the Fenwick northern property in relation to my marriage portion, as though I were a parcel of land being appended to a larger estate. He calculated what I was worth in the context of what he stood to gain from the arrangement, and you listened." She looked at him steadily. "I understand that you could not have done otherwise in that moment without creating a scene that would have served no one. I understand that listening is sometimes the only available option. I understand all of that." A pause. "But I have spent 24 years being the variable in other people's calculations, and I find I cannot continue in that position. Not even for this." She looked at the ring on the desk, then back at him. "Not even for you." The study was very quiet. The rain moved against the glass. The fire breathed in the grate, low and steady. He had not moved. "You think I see you as he does," he said. "I think you began by seeing me as an arrangement. I think the ring was offered in the spirit of an arrangement, I think." She stopped. She was not, as a general principle, a woman who stumbled over words. She had spent her entire adult life choosing words with care, because words were the primary tool available to a woman who had nothing else of particular social leverage. This was not a general principle situation. "I think you may have stopped seeing me that way somewhere in the middle of it all. And I think I may have. I think there is something here that I did not anticipate and that I cannot marry an arrangement, Your Grace. I find I have become too inconveniently fond of you to survive being treated as an arrangement by you, even occasionally, even unknowingly." Silence, the rain. He rose from the desk. He came around to her side of it, not quickly. Everything he did was measured. Everything had the quality of deliberate intention, and he stood before her with less distance between them than was their usual practice, and looked at her face with those eyes that had been reading her. She understood now, from the very first afternoon in October, with the same attention with which he had read every other text he had considered worth reading, which was, she thought, rather a great deal of attention. "I said you were not what I ordered," he said. "Yes, that remains true. What I ordered was a woman I would not need to think about. A woman who would occupy the appropriate social spaces without requiring my actual attention. Who would be present without being present, if you take my meaning." I ordered quiet. He looked at her with the expression of a man making a real and costly admission. "You are the least quiet person I have ever encountered, and you have, in 3 months, said almost nothing." She felt something move in her, something that had been waiting, with considerable patience and no real expectation, to be allowed to move. "I told your father last night," he said, "after you had retired and gone upstairs, that the settlement terms were not a subject to be discussed in your presence. I told him that discussions of that nature, discussions in which you are present as an object of negotiation rather than as a person with standing in the room, would not take place in my house or in my company." I said this quietly. I said it clearly. I said it in a way that did not require him to lose face publicly, because public loss of face produces resentment rather than change, and I wanted change. I believe he understood me. She stared at him. "You're upstairs," he continued. "Asleep, I assumed. I did not think it required waking you to report, and He paused. This pause was different from his other pauses. This had the quality of a man choosing words, not from an abundance of options, but from a scarcity of them. "I am aware that I should have told you in the morning. I did not know how to tell you in a way that did not also require me to say several other things I was not yet certain I was prepared to say." She looked at him. Outside, the December rain had committed to itself entirely. It was the kind of rain that alters the quality of the air inside a room, making it closer and warmer by contrast, making the room a more intimate fact than it would otherwise be. "What other things?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. He looked away, not with discomfort. He was not a man who showed discomfort through evasion, but with the specific attention of a person looking at a thing inside himself and examining it honestly before reporting on it. "I found," he said, to the rain against the window, "that I was not indifferent to the settlement negotiation or to your position within it. I found that your father's manner of discussing you, the ease of it, the complete absence of any apparent awareness that you were a person with your own stake in the outcome, produced in me a reaction that was not merely social. It was not merely the discomfort of a host whose table has been used poorly." He turned back to face her. I was angry, on your behalf, in a way that I found disproportionate given the duration of our acquaintance. And disproportionate responses, in my experience, require examination before they require expression. Claudia was quiet for a moment. She thought about 24 years. She thought about October light on a bare lime tree. She thought about a terrace in December and a voice that arrived like something placed quietly and deliberately on a table. She thought about what it means to be the variable in everyone's calculation and what it feels like, specifically and precisely, to be standing in a room with a man who seems to have put you, without announcement, at the center of his. She picked up the ring from the desk. She held it in her palm, the emerald cold, and then warming the gold familiar, she said, I should like to be asked, not because the arrangement requires it, not as a formality, because you actually wish to ask. He looked at her. The rain and the fire and the winter morning held the room steady around them, he said, and it was not the voice of a man reading weather, not the voice of a man administering an estate, not the voice of any of the versions of himself he managed and presented to the world. It was something underneath all of that, quieter and less controlled and entirely, unmistakably real. Claudia, will you marry me? Not quite a question, but different from before. Closer. The thing that kept it from rising at the end was not arrogance. She had learned the difference between his arrogance and his other silences. It was the specific quality of a feeling held so tightly that the voice could not perform the intonation of someone who could survive hearing no. She placed the ring on her own finger. It settled with the ease of something that knows where it belongs. She looked up at him. I find, she said, that I was not in the end what you ordered. She held his gaze without flinching. I hope I am something better. He looked at her for a long moment. The look was not the catalogue look, not the inventory look, not the look of a man reading a document. It was the look of a man who has been, in the most complete and unmanaged sense of the word, surprised, and who has discovered, in the moment of surprise, that surprise is not the administrative problem he had previously classified it as, that it is on certain occasions and with certain people, simply, good, yes, he said quietly, you are considerably better. They were married on the 6th of January, as originally planned, because the Duke saw no practical reason to alter a sensible date, simply because everything surrounding it had changed beyond all original recognition. The church was a small Norman building at the edge of the Ashworth estate, cold in the way of old stones in winter, smelling of beeswax and centuries and the particular damp holiness of English country churches in January. Claudia wore ivory silk and no ornament except the ring she had already worn and returned and taken back, and she carried nothing in her hands because she had decided, somewhere in the planning of the morning, that she had enough to carry already. Bron, when sat in the third pew in her best dress and a new hat that she had bought in London and denied purchasing, and she looked at the altar with the expression of a woman whose opinion has been vindicated and who does not require anyone to acknowledge this, since she has always known it herself. The Dowager Duchess wept silently into a handkerchief she produced from her sleeve with the practiced speed of a woman who has wept at weddings for 40 years and long ago ceased to be embarrassed by it. She maintained afterward that she had not wept, and that the cold had been, as she had warned, very hard on the eyes. Lady Margrave sat 3 rows behind the Dowager and watched the proceedings with an expression of genuine and only slightly grudging approval. She said afterward to the woman beside her that the bride was not at all what she had expected. She said it with the tone of a woman who has updated her expectations and found them, on consideration, improved by the revision. The Earl of Fenwick attended and was well pleased, and spoke to no one at length about settlement terms, having received in the fortnight prior a private conversation with the Duke of Ashworth, from which he had emerged with the distinct impression that his daughter's husband was a man whose patience had definite and enforced boundaries. He was not entirely certain what those boundaries were, but he had no particular desire to locate them experimentally. At the altar, the Duke stood with his back to the room and his face to the cold east window and the pale January light that came through it, the flat, clear, unornamented light of early winter, which shows everything exactly as it is. He heard the doors open. He heard the congregation rise. He did not turn immediately, because he was a man who controlled the pace of his own attention, who had always known what he was going to see before he turned to see it, and who was not, as a rule, unprepared. He turned. She was walking toward him through the January light in ivory silk, with the ring on her hand and her dark eyes looking at him with the same expression she had worn in his entrance hall in October. Observant, composed, entirely and completely herself. And he felt something happen in his chest that he had no precise word for, not because he lacked vocabulary, but because the word would have required him to have felt the thing before. And he had not. He had been very careful for a very long time not to. He took her hand when she reached him. She gave it without the slightest hesitation. The ring, the emerald, the old gold, the small diamonds at each corner, the thing that had been given and returned and given again, sat on her finger through the whole of the cold and quiet and entirely unexpected morning, as though it had known, from the very beginning of the whole improbable business, exactly where it was going. And the Duke of Ashworth, who had never once in 32 years been surprised, stood at the altar beside the woman he had not ordered and thought, "Good,